amongst nature in the great outdoors. In February 1939, he set out to Prince of Wales Island. The island covers an area of about 2,500 square miles. Today, it is popular with the tourism industry for the excellent hiking trails, camping, and fishing that it offers. Crist followed the Thorn River upstream to his favorite trapping spots. He took with him enough provisions to last him a couple of months in the wilderness. He had recently bought a top-of-the-line Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum revolver. This would likely have cost him the equivalent of $1,500 in today's money. They were relatively new at the time, perhaps only 5,000 manufactured by then. But Crist knew his guns, and he knew the importance of carrying such a firearm in the outdoors. He trudged through the snow alongside the river. After 10 miles, he finally made it to the cabin. This would be his home for the next couple of months. He unpacked his belongings and set about making a fire. The little cabin warmed up quickly, and Crist settled into life in the wilderness. Over the next few weeks, he continued his daily ritual of checking the previous day's traps and setting new ones. Venturing out from his cabin each day, he knew the area well. He enjoyed the excitement of trapping the animals and then taking them back to the cabin to be skinned and butchered. He had a fine collection and wasted nothing of each animal. On March 2nd, Crist left his cabin never to return. He packed for the day. He loaded his pistol into his holster, and his knife was secured onto his belt. The snow was beginning to melt, and the forest foliage was beginning to burst into life as spring was just around the corner. The following is based on circumstantial evidence presented by investigators at the time. It is one of a few explanations into the disappearance of Crist, and the dramatization of the story has been provided based on similar incidents and what is known of animal attacks. Crist had walked a few miles from his cabin. He had been checking his traps, which he had set along the Thorn River. His little rowboat was tied up in the river. He couldn't use it yet as the lake was still frozen over, but it would come in handy as the weather warmed up in the coming weeks. Then he would be able to fish in the middle of the lake and travel more easily to the far side. As he neared the lake, he heard a noise. He stood still and pricked his ears, listening hard. He had heard the snap of a twig. He knew there was something nearby. He unclipped his revolver from his holster and loaded it. But as he did so, he noticed the mainspring was broken. He unloaded the gun, placing the bullets into his pocket, and checked it over again. As he did so, he heard another sound. He looked up. He saw the imposing outline of a wolf 100 yards away. It stood, half concealed by a tree, its eyes locked onto Crist. It had been watching him. The tip of its nose twitched. Crist slowly backed up. His revolver was useless now. He placed it back into his holster, never taking his eyes off the wolf. He was in an area of smaller trees. They were thin and spindly. He knew he couldn't climb one if the wolf advanced, but there were larger trees on the other side of the lake that he could. He had seen wolves before. In the past, they had been shy and timid. He usually caught a glimpse of one as it ran away, spooked by his presence. But this time, it was different. This time, the wolf was bold. It was brazened. It was hunting him. Then, to his horror, he noticed another wolf amongst the trees to his right, and another to his left. He was surrounded. They began advancing towards him. He stepped backwards onto the frozen lake. The snow crunched under his feet. He pulled out his knife from its leather sheath and held it in front of him. It was now his only form of defense. With his heart in his mouth, he slowly retreated backwards across the lake. As the wolf pack followed him and stepped out of the tree line, Crist decided to make a run for it. He was a fit young man, 40 years old and in good physical shape. He threw his backpack onto the ice and sprinted to the other side of the lake. As he took off, the wolf's instinct kicked in, and they immediately chased him. Hot on his heels, they covered the open frozen lake in no time. Crist just about made it to the other side and desperately tried to scramble up a large tree. As he leapt for a low-lying branch, one of the wolves jumped at him. It grabbed him and knocked him to the ground. Crist tried to fight them off with his knife. He landed several blows, but there were too many of them. The attack lasted minutes. It was ferocious and brutal. Then, Crist was still. It wasn't until 4 months later, in July, that he was reported missing. He was known to go trapping for months at a time in Alaska, so his disappearance wasn't noted earlier. But his friends grew concerned when they had heard nothing from him since March. The United States Commissioner sent 2 men to search for Crist. They found his cabin and searched the area thoroughly. They came across his rowing boat, still tied upstream from the lake, but there was no sign of the woodsman. They decided that a search for Crist, if he had passed away, would be hopeless amongst all the summer foliage. They collected up his belongings from the cabin and sent them back to Ketchikan, from where Crist was from. Crist's friends were unhappy with the outcome of the search. They demanded that more was done to find their friend. So, they assembled another search party. The expedition was led by former game warden W.R. Selfridge. He took with him equipment that would enable them to drag the lake's floor in case his body was at the bottom. But it was now October. This was 7 months after it was believed Crist last left his cabin. Their search was incredibly thorough. They found the cabin on October 30th, and almost a week later, on November 5th, they found what they believed to be some of Crist's remains and torn clothing. It's possible Crist died of a heart attack or some other illness, but evidence suggested that he was pursued and then eaten by a pack of wolves. The most important pieces of information that were discovered were the sheathed knife and the revolver. The knife had wolf bite marks on its handle and was found on the lake's shoreline, not in its sheath, along with some torn clothing. Bone fragments and an almost complete skull were found 50 yards along, with the holstered revolver. It is possible a wolf managed to take the knife out of its leather sheath and drop it by the shore as it was scavenging Crist's remains. But it seems more likely that Crist took the knife out of its protective cover in order to use it himself. On inspection of the gun, the team found the main spring in the revolver was broken. The gun was unloaded. From this, they suggested that Crist had only discovered the faulty handgun once he had already left the cabin. There would have been no point in carrying a broken gun with him. The fact that it was unloaded suggests that he had tried to fix it. There were no witnesses of Crist's death. It seemed he had died alone. There was no chance of finding the wolves responsible and taking DNA samples to verify the attack. His case remains largely unsolved, but the suggestion of a wolf attack, given the evidence, seems a plausible explanation. At the time of the investigation, there had been no fatalities caused by wolves that had been recorded. What were thought to be Crist's remains were collected and buried in the Ketchikan cemetery. There is no date of birth marked at the grave, nor a date of death. Those details will remain unknown, as well as the explanation for his